Tonight, we journey back to a time when survival was not promised. The medieval peasants lived in a world where winters were merciless, and every frost carried the threat of death. But against the cold, they built something powerful: shelter. Not castles or palaces, but humble homes crafted with their bare hands, their traditions, and their unbreakable will to survive. Imagine yourself at the edge of a frozen field. The soil beneath your feet is hard as stone, the wind cuts like a blade, and snow falls in slow, relentless silence. Villagers hurry around you, gathering wood, patching walls, and stacking straw. Their every movement is deliberate, born from centuries of knowledge passed from parent to child. This is not just construction. It is survival. The cottages may appear crude, logs stacked together, walls sealed with mud and moss, roofs layered with straw. But each detail is a masterpiece of endurance. The angled thatch roofs shed snow before it can collapse the home. The thick clay walls trap heat. And inside, the hearth, a glowing fire pit, becomes the beating heart of every family. The fire must never die. Its crackle means life, warmth, and hope. Its smoke stains the rafters, fills the air, and lingers in the hair and clothes of every villager. For them, the smell of smoke was not discomfort. It was survival itself. And survival was never solitary. Neighbors worked side by side, cutting timber, hauling stone, sharing firewood, even opening their homes to the less fortunate. In the dead of winter, community was the strongest shield against the cold. Step inside one of these shelters, and you will find more than just walls and a roof. You will find ingenuity, resilience, and the human spirit refusing to be broken. So tonight, as you lie warm in your modern bed, remember this: medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold. They mastered it, with nothing but nature, tradition, and the determination to live another day. The villagers' determination grows stronger as the days shorten and the air thickens with frost. Every hour of preparation is vital, because once the snow buries the land, gathering new supplies becomes nearly impossible. Inside the cottages, life becomes slower, yet more focused. The family gathers around the hearth, spinning wool into yarn, repairing tools, and preparing food stores. Every task is a small defense against the unforgiving cold. Food, in fact, is as critical as the walls themselves. Without enough stored grains, dried meats, or preserved vegetables, a warm home means little. In autumn, peasants labor endlessly to fill their granaries and root cellars. Turnips, cabbages, onions, and dried beans are carefully stored underground, where the earth itself acts as insulation against frost. Smoked meat hangs from rafters, absorbing not just flavor but the very smoke that kept families alive. And yet, no matter how carefully they prepare, famine lurks at the edge of every winter. A poor harvest, an early freeze, or even a misplaced fire could spell disaster. For peasants, survival wasn't about comfort. It was about endurance, a constant negotiation with nature. As the storm winds howl outside, the home becomes more than a structure. It is a fortress of warmth, a fragile but vital bubble of life in a frozen world. Children huddle close to their parents, wrapped in rough woolen blankets, listening to the crackle of the fire. Elders whisper stories of winters past, tales of both tragedy and triumph. And outside, the village itself transforms. Paths disappear beneath snowdrifts, animals crowd into barns warmed by hay and straw, and silence settles across the fields. It is a silence broken only by the rhythm of axes chopping wood and the low voices of neighbors checking on one another. These peasants had little, yet they possessed something more valuable than gold or jewels: knowledge. Knowledge of the land, of the seasons, and of the shelters that stood as their only defense against death. It was not the strength of stone walls or the wealth of kings that carried them through winter. It was the resilience of ordinary people, armed only with tradition, unity, and faith that spring would come again. And when it finally did, when the snow melted and green returned to the fields, these same cottages stood as monuments to survival. Humble though they were, they carried within them the stories of generations who had stared down the coldest of winters, and lived. The days stretch endlessly, each one colder than the last. Inside the peasant cottages, survival has become a daily ritual, a rhythm dictated by fire, food, and faith. The hearth remains the heart of every home, but it is not enough to simply sit by the flames. To truly endure, every member of the family must play their part. Children fetch small branches to keep the fire alive. Women mend clothing, patching worn wool with scraps of fabric, while men sharpen tools for the next trip into the forest. Even the elderly, though slowed by age, contribute with knowledge, passing down stories of winters harsher than this, reminding the young that survival is possible if they do not give up. Clothing itself becomes another weapon against the cold. Forget the furs of kings and nobles. Peasants rely on coarse wool, linen, and, if fortunate, scraps of sheepskin. Woolen tunics, thick cloaks, and hand-stitched mittens become lifelines, layered one over the other. The garments are heavy and itchy, but in the biting frost, they are precious armor. Boots are stuffed with straw to trap heat, and woolen caps are pulled low, protecting ears from the cutting wind. And then there are the animals. To a medieval peasant, livestock is not only food, but warmth. Cows, goats, and sheep are housed in barns built close to the cottages, their body heat raising the temperature just enough to keep the frost at bay. Chickens roost in the corners, pigs root in the hay, and every breath of warm animal air contributes to the fragile balance of survival. The peasants know this well: without their animals, they would not see spring. Outside, the land lies silent, blanketed in snow. The fields are lifeless, the rivers frozen. But the silence is deceptive. Beneath the snow, the seeds of spring wait. The peasants believe in this cycle, trusting that every winter, no matter how brutal, must eventually give way to new life. Their faith, whether in the turning of the seasons or in God's mercy, becomes another form of shelter, invisible but powerful. Nights are the hardest. Darkness stretches for hours, sometimes feeling endless. The only light comes from the fire or a tallow candle burning low. It is during these long nights that fear creeps in, fear of wolves prowling near the village, of sickness spreading through the cramped homes, or of the fire going out. Yet it is also during these nights that families grow closest. They sing songs, tell stories, and pray together, weaving bonds of resilience that are as vital as the mud and timber of their homes. Winter, in the medieval world, was not just a season. It was a test. A test of strength, of unity, and of endurance. And though many did not survive, those who did carried their traditions forward, teaching the next generation how to build, how to prepare, and above all, how to endure. The snow outside continues to fall, silent and steady, but inside these small, humble shelters, life persists. The peasants huddle together, warmed by fire, by family, and by faith, waiting for the day when the first green shoots will break through the frozen ground, and the world will awaken once more. The harsh winter drags on, each night colder and longer than the one before. And yet, beyond the physical struggle to keep warm, peasants faced another battle, the battle of the mind, of faith, and of fear. For them, shelter was not just timber and mud. It was also protection against the unseen. Medieval life was steeped in belief, and winter, with its silence and shadows, brought out the deepest fears and strongest rituals. In many villages, before a roof was laid, peasants whispered prayers over the wooden beams, asking God to keep their homes safe from storms. Crosses were carved into doorframes, both as blessings and as wards against evil. Some families tucked small tokens, sprigs of herbs, iron nails, or carved charms, into the walls as they built, believing these objects could repel sickness or wandering spirits that thrived in the dark months. Superstition ran deep. The long nights gave space for imagination, and in the howling of the wind, peasants often claimed to hear voices. Some said they were ancestors watching over them, others believed they were demons scratching at the doors. To guard against such dangers, villagers hung bunches of garlic, holly, or rowan above their doors and windows, natural symbols thought to drive away evil forces. The hearth itself, the lifeblood of the home, was treated almost as sacred. No one was allowed to let it die out completely. A flame kept alive through the night was a promise of protection, and in some villages, neighbors would share fire with one another if their own hearths went cold, passing burning embers in clay pots from home to home. To lose the fire was not only a practical danger, but a spiritual omen. Children were often told stories by the elders to keep them both entertained and cautious. Tales of winter spirits that preyed on the careless, of wolves that could slip into cottages if doors weren't barred, of witches who thrived in the cold. These stories blended fear with wisdom. They taught children never to waste firewood, never to wander too far into the forest, and never to let the flame die. And then there were the rituals of hope. On certain nights, families would gather around the hearth, not just to warm themselves, but to pray together. Some would sprinkle salt around the room to keep evil at bay. Others would place bread by the fire as an offering, a plea for survival through the harsh season. Whether born of religion, tradition, or sheer desperation, these acts gave peasants the courage to endure. The walls of their homes held more than mud, wood, and straw. They held centuries of belief, of whispered prayers, of charms tucked away in corners. And in the heart of winter, when the cold seemed endless and the nights unbearable, it was these traditions that gave strength just as surely as the fire gave heat. Because survival was never just about the body. It was about the spirit. And in that way, the medieval peasants built more than homes, they built fortresses of faith, standing against the cold and the darkness, waiting for the first light of spring to break through. And yet, even in the bleakest winters, life was not only about endurance. It was also about finding moments of light within the darkness. Festivals, traditions, and small celebrations gave medieval peasants hope, a reminder that even the coldest night would eventually give way to spring. The most important of these was Christmas, or what older traditions called Yule. For peasants, it was not a grand feast like that of kings and lords, but a time when the entire village came together to share what little they had. A pig might be slaughtered, its meat salted and divided among families. Ale was brewed in advance, and though the mugs were small, the warmth of the drink filled both body and spirit. Evergreens, holly, ivy, and pine, were brought into homes, not only as decoration but as symbols of life that endured through winter. A log, often massive, was chosen to burn in the hearth, the Yule log. It was meant to smolder slowly for days, a flame that promised life, luck, and protection. To let it burn out too soon was considered bad fortune. Families would sometimes keep the ashes of the log, believing they held protective powers against sickness and storms. But festivals were not only about food or fire, they were about community. In villages, neighbors often gathered to sing, dance, and tell stories. Children were taught carols passed down through generations. Old folk tales were retold by the elders, binding the young and old together in shared memory. For a few days, laughter replaced fear, and music drowned out the howling of the wind. Even the church played a vital role. Priests reminded peasants that winter was a test of faith, and that enduring the cold was part of God's plan. Midnight masses glowed with candlelight, and hymns echoed through wooden chapels, lifting hearts weighed down by hunger and frost. For many, this reminder of faith was as important as bread itself. There were also smaller, local traditions. In some regions, peasants believed in first footing. The first person to enter the home after midnight on New Year's could bring luck or misfortune depending on who they were. Gifts of bread, salt, or firewood were exchanged, not for wealth, but for survival. These tokens symbolized what truly mattered in winter: food, warmth, and community. These festivals did not erase the hardship. Bellies were still empty, frost still crept through the walls, and death was always close at hand. But for a few days, peasants could pretend that life was more than just survival, that joy was possible even in the cruelest months. And that was the true power of their winter traditions. Not the food or the fire, but the belief that spring would return. That the snow would melt, the fields would awaken, and the earth would once again give back what it had taken. Because in the end, what kept medieval peasants alive was not just shelter, or fire, or food. It was hope. The hope that tomorrow might be kinder than today. And with every song sung by the fire, every prayer whispered into the night, and every ember kept glowing in the hearth, that hope burned on, brighter than the coldest winter. When at last the grip of winter began to loosen, the medieval peasant world shifted once more. The snow, which for months had buried the earth in silence, slowly melted into streams that trickled through the fields. The forests, once stripped bare, showed their first buds, and the air that had been sharp with frost carried the faintest scent of soil and growth. For peasants, this change was not just a relief, it was a rebirth. Spring meant survival had been achieved. Every ember they guarded, every wall of mud they patched, every prayer whispered in the freezing dark, all of it had carried them here. The moment the ground softened, men and women hurried into the fields. Plows, often pulled by oxen or even by families themselves, carved through the thawed earth. Seeds, saved carefully through the winter, were scattered with both urgency and reverence. A failed crop could mean disaster when the next cold season came, so planting was done with precision, guided by both tradition and faith. Children, no longer confined to smoky huts, ran barefoot through damp grass, chasing each other with the reckless joy of having survived another winter. Their laughter carried across the fields, a sound peasants often said was proof that God had spared them. Villages came alive again with the sound of hammers and tools. Roofs that had sagged under heavy snow were repaired. Broken fences were rebuilt to keep livestock safe. Wells were cleaned, and muddy pathways between cottages became busy with footsteps. Life surged forward with the same energy as the rivers, swollen from melted ice. But spring was not only about work, it was also about gratitude. Many villages held small festivals at the start of planting season. Simple gatherings with bread, cheese, and what ale remained from the winter stores. A priest might bless the fields, sprinkling holy water over the soil, while families prayed for rain, for sun, and for mercy from the sky. There was also remembrance. Those who had not survived the winter were honored. Graves, often marked with wooden crosses or simple stones, were cleaned and decorated with the first wildflowers of the season. Families spoke the names of the lost, ensuring they would not be forgotten. Survival in the medieval world was never taken for granted, and each spring carried both joy and sorrow. Yet, despite all hardship, there was always renewal. The same cycle of struggle and hope repeated year after year, binding generation to generation. Children who once listened to winter tales by the hearth would grow to tell those stories themselves. The knowledge of how to build, how to endure, and how to believe was passed forward, not through books, but through lives lived. And so, the story of medieval peasants was not only one of suffering, but of endurance. Against winters that could kill, against hunger and fear, they built shelters not just of wood and earth, but of faith and community. They endured the coldest nights with the fire of hope, waiting for the warmth of spring to return. Because in the medieval world, survival was not only about outlasting winter. It was about proving, year after year, that no matter how cruel the cold, the spirit of life was stronger still. And so, as the centuries passed, the memory of those winters never faded. Each generation of peasants inherited not only the land but also the lessons of survival. They learned to read the sky, to feel the soil, to guard the flame that meant life, and to trust that no matter how harsh the season, spring would always return. The shelters they built may have been humble, mud walls, thatched roofs, earthen floors, but inside them lived something far greater. These were not just houses. They were sanctuaries of human resilience. Every beam of wood, every stone laid by hand, carried the weight of determination. To survive the coldest winter was to defy nature itself. And when we look back today, we see more than the hardship. We see the endurance of ordinary people who found extraordinary strength in the face of relentless cold. Their world had no comfort of modern heating, no guarantee of food, no safety from illness. Yet, through faith, community, and ingenuity, they endured. The crackling fire in the hearth, the prayers whispered in the dark, the laughter of children wrapped in wool, all these fragments of life were the quiet victories of peasants who refused to surrender. Because survival was not only measured in the number of days lived, but in the spirit that endured through them. And in that spirit, medieval peasants left us a legacy, a reminder that even in the coldest of winters, warmth can be created, not just from fire, but from hope, belief, and the bonds of human togetherness. This is the story of how they endured, how they built, and how they survived the coldest winter. Not just with their hands, but with their hearts. Even beyond their own lifetimes, the story of medieval peasants' survival in winter became part of folklore, legend, and history. Generations repeated the same patterns, but each added their own wisdom to the cycle. A grandmother taught her grandchildren how to weave straw tighter for insulation. A father showed his son how to stack firewood so it dried faster in the weak sun. A mother passed on the prayers she whispered over the hearth every night. The rhythm of survival became tradition, and tradition became culture. What began as desperate acts to keep out the cold slowly transformed into the customs that defined village life. Songs sung at the hearth, charms tucked into the walls, and rituals performed before planting all carried echoes of winters past. Over time, these small acts of endurance shaped the very identity of medieval communities. A village that survived a cruel winter carried stories of resilience, stories that bound its people closer together. Shared hardship created loyalty, shared survival created unity. Neighbors remembered who had shared fire when one family's hearth went cold, who had lent bread when hunger struck, and who had helped repair a roof under falling snow. These bonds mattered just as much as food or shelter. And while lords in their stone castles and kings in their courts lived very different lives, the peasant struggle told a universal truth: survival is built not on wealth, but on cooperation, belief, and the will to endure. Looking back, their huts may seem crude, their tools primitive, and their lives harsh. But every log laid, every ember saved, and every prayer spoken was part of a larger story, the human story. A story of persistence against impossible odds. When we think of medieval history, it is easy to picture knights, castles, and battles. But the real heartbeat of that world was here, in the smoky huts of peasants, huddled together against the cold, whispering songs of hope, teaching children to believe that spring would always come. And so, the shelters they built were not just homes. They were symbols. Symbols that even in the face of the coldest winter, humanity would not surrender. Because survival was never just about living through the night. It was about creating the promise of tomorrow. Through the long arc of history, the echoes of those winters remain. The medieval peasant struggle was not written in grand chronicles or gilded manuscripts, but in the quiet persistence of daily life. It lived in the crack of splitting firewood, in the hands calloused from weaving straw, and in the voices that sang softly in the dark to keep fear away. Every shelter was a message to the future: we endured. Each smoky hut and patched roof stood as proof that ordinary people, with little more than determination, could stand against nature's fiercest trial. And though centuries have passed, their lessons remain strikingly familiar. Even today, in times of crisis, people return to the same instincts: to build, to share, to protect one another, and to hold on to hope when everything else seems lost. The tools have changed, but the heart of survival has not. The medieval peasant's story is, in truth, our story. The human ability to adapt, to endure, and to believe in tomorrow is what has carried us through every storm. Their winters remind us that survival is never guaranteed, it is earned, day by day, through effort, unity, and faith. So when we look back at the huts of mud and timber, at the fires that never went out, and at the people who huddled together against the coldest nights, we do not just see history. We see resilience. We see the unbroken thread of humanity that stretches from their frozen fields to our modern lives. And perhaps, in remembering them, we also remember this: no matter how dark the night, no matter how cold the season, the warmth of human spirit can always endure. That is how medieval peasants survived the coldest winter. Not merely by building shelters of wood and clay, but by building shelters of hope, of faith, and of community, strong enough to outlast the cold itself. And so, as the firelight of their world flickers in our imagination, we are left with a truth as enduring as the shelters they built. Survival was never just about mud walls, timber beams, or thatched roofs. It was about the choices they made each day, to share food when there was barely enough, to guard the flame through the longest night, and to keep faith alive when the earth itself seemed barren and silent. The medieval peasant did not leave behind monuments of stone like kings, or poems sung in courts like nobles. Instead, they left something far more powerful, a legacy of resilience. A reminder that history is not only written in the deeds of the mighty, but in the quiet endurance of the humble. Every winter tested them. Some families were lost to hunger or frost. Yet, others endured, passing on their hard-won knowledge to children who would face the cold anew. Their survival was not a triumph of wealth, but of spirit. And in that struggle, we find the roots of our own humanity. Today, when we step into a warm home, light a fire with the flick of a switch, or share a meal without fear of famine, we are standing on the shoulders of those who came before. Those who, with almost nothing, learned how to endure the worst winters the world could offer. Their story is not just history, it is a mirror. It shows us what it means to persist when the odds are against us. To create warmth when the world is cold. To find hope when the night is endless. And so, the tale of medieval peasants braving the coldest winters is not a forgotten chapter of the past. It is a timeless truth, that in every age, in every trial, it is not luxury or power that keeps humanity alive, it is resilience, faith, and the unyielding will to survive. This is their story. This is our inheritance. The shelter they built still stands, not in wood or straw, but in the enduring spirit of survival. Their world, though distant in time, still whispers to us. Every collapsed hut now buried beneath centuries of soil, every broken hearthstone found by archaeologists, tells a story of hands that refuse to give up. These fragments of peasant life are not ruins of weakness, they are monuments of strength. The coldest winters were merciless teachers. They taught peasants to prepare in times of plenty, to gather wood and food with care, to treasure every ember as if it were life itself. They taught them to lean on neighbors when walls cracked under snow, to share warmth and bread so that no one family faced the storm alone. And above all, they taught them patience, the kind of patience that waits months in the dark, trusting that spring will return. We, in our modern world, may never know the bite of hunger as they did, or the sharp fear of a fire going out in the night. But the echoes of their lessons remain. We still gather around warmth, we still cling to one another in times of trial, and we still believe in the promise that after hardship comes renewal. To remember medieval peasants is not only to recall how they lived, it is to honor what they gave us. A heritage of resilience. A living proof that greatness is not found only in castles or crowns, but in cottages of mud and straw, where families endured together through the longest nights. Their shelters may have crumbled, their names may be forgotten, but their spirit endures, carried in the simple truth that as long as people can come together, build with their hands, and hope with their hearts, no winter is truly unconquerable. And so, the story does not end with their survival. It lives on with us. Because every time humanity faces its own storms, whether of nature, of hardship, or of fear, we are repeating the same story. The story of enduring, of sheltering, of waiting for light after darkness. This is the eternal rhythm of survival. It began with them. As the years rolled on, generation after generation of peasants carried these traditions forward, refining them in small ways but never straying from the wisdom that had kept their ancestors alive. A child who once sat close to the hearth, listening to the fire crackle while snow beat against the thatched roof, would one day grow into an adult responsible for building and maintaining that same shelter. Knowledge was not written in books for them, it was carved into memory, spoken in quiet instruction, and lived through experience. The rhythm of survival became the rhythm of life itself. In the autumn months, families worked tirelessly, gathering, repairing, and preparing. By winter, their lives slowed, centered around the fire, storytelling, weaving, mending tools, and planning for the year ahead. These months of stillness were as important as the labor-filled seasons. They gave peasants time to reflect, to strengthen family bonds, and to teach children the skills they too would one day need. Inside the huts, every object told a story. The wooden benches that doubled as sleeping platforms were smoothed by countless winters of weary bodies resting upon them. Beyond the village, the landscape itself bore the marks of survival. Forest edges showed careful cutting, never wasteful, always mindful of tomorrow. Fields were left fallow not simply out of agricultural necessity but because the peasants knew the earth, like themselves, needed rest to return stronger in the spring. This balance between taking and giving back to the land was not philosophy, it was survival. And when winters turned especially cruel, when snow fell too heavy, when wolves came prowling closer to the villages, when famine threatened, peasants leaned not only on their shelters but on their faith. Small crosses carved into wooden beams, charms hung above doorways, prayers whispered before the fire, these were as much a shield against despair as the walls and roofs themselves. For in times when nature was overwhelming, belief was a shelter of its own, a reminder that even in the darkest nights, hope flickered like a flame. The cycle repeated endlessly. Children became parents, parents became elders, and each generation carried forward both the hardships and the quiet victories of those who came before. Their huts, humble and temporary, might have been rebuilt again and again, but the spirit behind them was unshakable. And so, when we look back on the medieval peasants and their shelters, we see more than walls of mud, straw, and timber. We see the blueprint of resilience. We see a people who mastered the art of making life out of very little, who turned fragile structures into bastions of warmth, and who proved, again and again, that survival was not just possible, but inevitable when hearts, hands, and hope worked together. Even as centuries passed, the echoes of these winters never faded. Villages rose and fell, kingdoms changed hands, and new tools were invented. But the essence of survival remained the same. The lessons carved into the daily life of peasants lingered in ways that still touch us today. Think of the way families even now gather around warmth during the cold months. The fire in a modern fireplace, the hum of a heater, or even the simple comfort of a shared blanket on a freezing night, all of it carries the same spirit of togetherness that once bound medieval peasants by the hearth. Their methods may have been different, but their purpose was identical, to create a circle of life against the darkness pressing in from outside. The architecture of their shelters, too, left its mark. Techniques of wattle and daub, thatched roofing, and timber framing still influence restoration projects and inspire sustainable housing movements today. What peasants did out of necessity, we now often revisit out of wisdom. In their simplicity, they found efficiency. In their humility, they found endurance. But perhaps the most powerful legacy they left behind was not material at all. It was the mindset, the unshakable belief that even in the bleakest of times, survival is possible through preparation, cooperation, and resilience. Their winters were merciless, but they never yielded. And in that refusal to break, they left us a map for facing our own hardships. Picture this, a family huddled together inside a mud and straw hut, the wind howling outside, the snow piling against the door. The father rises to stoke the fire, the mother ladles broth into wooden bowls, children curl close beneath wool blankets. Outside, nature rages. Inside, there is warmth, laughter, even storytelling. This is not just survival, this is humanity's quiet triumph. Every stone they laid, every log they carried, every fire they kindled was part of something greater than themselves. It was part of a chain of survival stretching across generations, a rhythm of endurance that beats even now in our modern lives. So the next time you step into the warmth of your home on a freezing night, pause for a moment. Think of the peasants who, with nothing but their hands, their will, and their faith, carved survival out of the harshest winters. Their shelters may no longer stand, but their spirit still does, within us, around us, and in every flame we light against the dark. Because winter always comes. But so too does the human will to endure. And then, at last, after months of silence and frost, the first signs of change begin to stir. The endless white that once blanketed the fields slowly recedes, revealing patches of dark soil beneath. The icy rivers crack and groan as water begins to move again, carrying with it the promise of life. For the peasants, spring is not simply a season, it is salvation. The huts, worn by smoke and weather, have done their duty. Families emerge, blinking in the pale sunlight, their faces leaner, their clothes patched, but their spirits intact. Children, who had spent long months indoors, now run into the fields, chasing each other over the thawing ground. The elderly step carefully into the open air, lifting their hands to the sun as if greeting an old friend. The long trial of winter has ended. Work begins immediately. Tools are sharpened, plows are brought from storage, and seeds carefully preserved from the year before are prepared for planting. Survival has shifted from endurance to renewal. The earth, once hard and lifeless, is now soft and ready to give again. Each furrow dug into the soil is more than just farming, it is an act of hope, a declaration that the village has survived and will continue to thrive. Spring festivals return as well, moments of joy that balance the hardships of the months before. Bonfires are lit, songs are sung, and stories are told of how families endured the coldest nights. These gatherings are not just for celebration but also for remembrance. Every winter claims its price, and those who did not survive are honored with prayers and rituals, their memory woven into the fabric of the community. The shelters themselves, though battered, stand as proof of endurance. Roofs are repaired, walls patched, and hearths cleaned for the next cycle of seasons. Each repair is a reminder, the battle against winter will come again. But for now, the peasants live in the light, taking strength from the earth, the sun, and each other. And so the cycle continues. Winter teaches endurance, spring offers renewal, summer brings labor, and autumn demands preparation. Year after year, century after century, peasants moved through this rhythm, surviving not because life was easy, but because they understood that every season had its role. When we look back, it is easy to romanticize castles and kings, but the true backbone of medieval life lay in these small villages, in the cottages of mud and straw, in the hearths that burned through the night, and in the families who refused to give in to the cold. Their shelters were more than homes, they were symbols of resilience, hope, and the timeless will of humanity to endure. And if you listen closely, even now, you can almost hear it, the crackle of firewood, the laughter of children chasing each other in the thawing fields, and the quiet determination of hands working the soil. This is the legacy of the medieval peasant, and it lives on, long after the coldest winters have passed. Through the turning of seasons, one truth became undeniable: the peasant's survival was never an accident. It was the result of ritual, rhythm, and resilience passed down like a sacred inheritance. Each family, each village, became part of a chain, stretching back to ancestors long forgotten and forward to children not yet born, bound together by the knowledge of how to endure. By summer, their fields grew green and heavy with grain. Livestock wandered freely in pastures, bells chiming softly in the warm air. The same people who once huddled close to smoky fires now worked beneath the blazing sun, their bodies bent to the land but their spirits lifted by abundance. Summer was not a time of rest but of relentless labor, for peasants knew the truth: every harvest, every bundle of hay, every sheaf of wheat was a shield against the next inevitable winter. Autumn was perhaps the most anxious season of all. The sky darkened earlier each day, and a crisp edge sharpened the air. Granaries were filled, tools repaired, and firewood stacked high in careful piles. Children helped gather berries, herbs, and mushrooms, the last gifts of the forest before frost returned. The work was not frantic, but deliberate, like the beating of a steady drum. Each task was a reminder that the cold would come again, and it would show no mercy to those who were unprepared. When the first snow returned, no one was surprised. The huts stood ready, the hearth stocked with fuel, the people braced for another season of trial. And yet, no matter how many winters they endured, each arrival of frost carried the same weight of awe and dread. It was as if nature herself demanded a tax each year, a test of endurance, of patience, of unity. But the peasants met that test, time and time again. Their shelters, humble as they were, stood like fortresses of hope against the endless white. The walls of mud and timber held back the chill, the thatched roofs defied the snow, and the hearth fires glowed with the promise of survival. Within those walls, humanity endured, not in grandeur or glory, but in the simple, unyielding will to live. Winter was never the end. It was a passage, a harsh gateway through which every generation had to walk. And though it stripped the land bare, though it tested bones and spirits, it also gave birth to renewal. By surviving winter, peasants did more than preserve their lives. They preserved culture. Around their fires, they told stories, myths of saints and spirits, of heroes who braved the cold and triumphed. These tales, passed down from mouth to mouth, were as important as bread, for they gave people something no hearth alone could offer: hope. Hope carried them when their hands cracked from frostbite, when their bellies ached from hunger, when the howling winds outside made the world seem endless and merciless. Hope was the true fire that kept them alive. And in spring, that fire bore fruit. Fields thawed, rivers ran free again, and the sound of bells and laughter returned to the villages. Children, once pale and quiet from long nights indoors, burst into the sunlight with energy as boundless as the green hills that returned around them. The cycle repeated, year after year, but never without meaning. Each winter overcome was a victory, not of kings or lords, but of ordinary people whose names history rarely remembers. Yet their resilience was greater than any monument of stone. For without them, there would have been no fields tended, no harvests gathered, no kingdom sustained. The peasants, in their shelters of wood, mud, and straw, bore the weight of civilization on their shoulders. Their story is one of survival, yes, but also one of triumph. Because to live when the odds are against you is the greatest triumph of all. And so, when we think of the medieval world, let us not only picture knights in armor or castles rising from the mist. Let us remember the huts crouched beneath the snow, the humble fires burning in the dark, the families who whispered prayers and held each other close as the cold pressed in. For there, in the simplest of shelters, the true heart of history beat strongest. Because survival is not built on stone walls or swords. It is built on hands that gather, voices that comfort, and hearts that refuse to yield. That is how medieval peasants endured the coldest winters. And that is why their legacy still lives in us today. And yet, even as centuries passed, the lessons of those winters did not fade. Every generation of peasants carried forward the wisdom carved into their lives by struggle. They understood the rhythm of scarcity and abundance, the fragile balance between nature's fury and human endurance. Their shelters became more than walls, they were classrooms, teaching children the art of survival with every flicker of the hearth. Mothers taught daughters how to weave thatch tightly enough to keep snow from seeping in. Fathers taught sons how to cut wood in the autumn so it would be seasoned and ready when the bitter months arrived. Grandparents reminded all with quiet stories of winters past, when hunger had knocked at the door and cold had stolen loved ones, but also when perseverance had carried the family through. Winter, then, was not merely endured. It was prepared for, studied, even respected like a stern but fair teacher. And in that preparation, the peasants found dignity. Though their lives were humble, their victories small and quiet, each one mattered. Each winter survived was proof that their way of life, though fragile, was strong enough to endure another cycle of time. Their resilience shaped entire communities. Festivals and church gatherings, timed carefully with the seasons, gave rhythm to the hardships. Music and prayer echoed in small wooden chapels, reminding everyone that survival was not just physical, it was spiritual. To endure, they needed one another as much as they needed food or fire. And so, even in the darkest cold, laughter and song sometimes rose like sparks against the endless night. That is the hidden truth of the medieval world, that strength did not only belong to kings or knights, but to the peasants in their humble shelters. To those who, with bare hands and stubborn hearts, shaped homes out of mud, straw, and wood. Who learned to bend, but never to break. Their story is the story of humanity itself. Because in every age, in every corner of the world, people have faced their own winters, some of snow and ice, others of hardship and despair. And time again, they have built their own shelters. Not always with timber and clay, but with unity, courage, and hope. And just as those peasants once huddled close to their hearths, keeping the flame alive through endless nights, so too do we today carry forward that eternal fire. A fire that whispers, no winter lasts forever. And so, when we step back and imagine those frozen landscapes, fields blanketed in white, cottages half buried under snow, smoke rising in thin threads against a gray sky, we are not just picturing a distant past. We are looking into a mirror of ourselves. For the heart that beats within us today is the same heart that beat within them, defiant, resilient, and unwilling to surrender. The peasants did not know comfort as we do. They did not have central heating, electricity, or medicine to ease the suffering of long winters. Yet, in many ways, their strength outshines ours. They relied on each other in ways we have nearly forgotten. A neighbor's fire might mean survival for an entire family. A loaf of bread shared could mean the difference between despair and hope. Community was not optional, it was life itself. Generations were shaped in this crucible of frost and fire. Each child raised in the rhythm of hardship grew into an adult who understood the value of preparation, of patience, of gratitude. The seasons etched lessons into their bones, lessons that still echo faintly in us whenever we gather for warmth. History often remembers kings and castles, wars and treaties. But the true foundation of the medieval world, the quiet heartbeat that kept it alive, was found in those small, smoky shelters. In hands calloused from labor. In voices singing despite hunger. In families pressing close together against the howl of the storm. The peasants' shelters were not just defenses against winter. They were sanctuaries of the human spirit. Fragile, temporary, easily lost to time, and yet stronger than stone, because they held something eternal, the will to live. That will carried them through the coldest winters. It carried them into spring, into harvest, into the future. And it carries us still. Because the story of survival is never truly finished. It is written anew each time humanity faces its own season of trial. And as long as the fire burns, in hearths, in homes, in hearts, the story will continue. The medieval peasants are long gone. But their legacy remains. A legacy of resilience. A legacy of hope. A legacy that whispers across the centuries, no winter, however long, can conquer the human spirit. And even as we close the chapter on their world, the image of those shelters lingers. The walls of timber and clay, the thatched roofs bending beneath snow, the faint orange glow of fire seen through cracks in the night, these are not just relics of a forgotten time. They are symbols, carved into the very story of humanity. When we walk through a modern city today, surrounded by glass and steel, it is easy to forget that our ancestors once measured survival in handfuls of grain and in how tightly they could seal the gaps of a mud wall. Yet, without their endurance, we would not stand here. Every convenience we take for granted, warm rooms, stocked kitchens, steady light, exists because they first endured the storm. Their world was hard, but it was also alive with meaning. Every task, from chopping wood to patching a roof, carried the weight of life and death. Snow still drifts across the abandoned fields. The shelters of the peasants are gone now, swallowed by centuries, reduced to soil and memory. Yet, if you listen closely, you can almost hear them still, the crackle of a fire in the dark, the low murmur of prayers, the steady rhythm of life refusing to be broken. Their huts were not grand. Their tools were simple. But their courage was vast. In every thatched roof, in every rough wall of mud and wood, lived a truth greater than any crown or castle, that survival itself is the greatest victory. And though winter came again and again, they always endured. They endured for their children, for their villages, for the promise that spring would return. The peasants are long gone. But the spirit they carried, the fire that burned within their shelters, still lives in us. Because winter will always come. But so will we. Fade to black. The screen lingers on a single glowing ember, slowly fading, before it sparks again.